Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. I am a fifth-year PhD student in the clinical psychology program at Vanderbilt University, and I'm also a member of the ABCT Student Membership Committee, who sponsors panels and creates resources to benefit current and prospective students in areas related to professional development. So today we have gathered an amazing group of graduate students and ABCT members to speak to their experiences in graduate school, particularly as it pertains to their identity and interests around sexual or gender minorities. So the aim of the panel is to provide current and prospective students who identify as sexual or gender minority students with a resource on considerations for navigating graduate school in a way that aligns with their values and supports their identity and interests. So I am going to turn it over to our panelists and let them introduce themselves. So panelists, if you want to go ahead and share who you are.
Okay, I'll start. Hi, everyone. My name is Benji, he, him pronouns. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in clinical psychology at Nova Southeastern University. Research-wise, I'm interested in examining the psychosocial mechanisms underlying behavioral health disparities affecting LGBTQ populations, with a focus on increasing awareness of intersectionality and increasing also resistance against various forms of stigma within this population. And yeah, I'll pass it off to Allison.
Hi, everybody. I'm Allison. I am a fifth-year doctoral candidate at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I use she and they pronouns, and my research interests are in sexual and gender-based violence, and particularly the experiences of sexual and gender minorities. And I'm going to pass it off to Kevin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Areen. I'm a fourth-year clinical psychology doctoral student at William James College in Newton, Massachusetts. My pronouns are he, him, his, and my research interests are largely on culturally affirming evidence-based treatments for anxiety-related conditions in a variety of diverse populations, as well as cultural factors that impact anxiety-related conditions. And I'll pass it over to Alex.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently a sixth-year doctoral candidate at American University in DC. I'm technically an eighth-year grad student at American University in Dr. Nate Herr's lab because I did the master's program there. So I'm happy to touch on that at any point if it comes up. And I am currently a clinical psychology resident at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine here in Chicago. My research interests have always been under the umbrella of looking at individual personality traits or personality pathology and how those intersect with emotional processes like emotion regulation, empathy, and then within relationship contexts. And so later in my doctoral training, I shifted gears a little bit to taking on the looking at those things within SGM populations. And so in my dissertation, I'm looking at bi plus plurosexual women who are partnered in romantic relationships and looking at some outcomes there.
Perfect. Thank you all for the wonderful introductions. Before we jump right into asking some questions, I just have a little bit of information to share from an ABCT perspective. So the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies is a national organization, and there are a couple of different ways to get involved. I'm posting the link here in case that's of interest to you. And then there's also a sexual and gender minority special interest group who we collaborated with for this webisode in particular, who has a whole host of great resources available through their website as well. And those include mentorship opportunities and lists of mentors accepting students, annual awards, as well as resources like data and measures and grants, etc. So if those are things that you're interested in, feel free to write these links down or click on them and navigate to those pages. So we have an amazing group of panelists today who are going to speak a little bit on particular in this topic. And I think maybe the easiest way to get started is to ask somewhat of a broad question to get going here. So I'm wondering, panelists, if you can speak a little bit to what role, if any, your identity played in applying or selecting graduate programs. So for example, things like location, mentorship, etc.
Okay, who would like to start? I guess I'll start. Okay, so it played a huge role. It was probably played the most important role, I guess, in identifying a mentor because my research interests are primarily within the spectrum of LGBTQ health. And so I wanted to find a mentor who was very affirming of my identities and that was willing to work with me on those social issues that I care really deeply about. It was really hard finding a mentor actually. It's hard getting into a program in general and so very competitive. And so, I looked all over and made sure to look at everyone's CVs and their, job descriptions, their research interests. And eventually I came across, quite a few different mentors. And yeah, that's the first step, just being able to like find the person. And even though the person I work with doesn't specifically work on LGBTQ health issues, I knew she would be affirming of my identities because she has a very strong stigma social justice focus, particularly within issues related to weight bias. And I knew during our interview that she'd be interested in like working with me on, intersecting weight bias with other social issues as well, including LGBTQ stigma and health and all of that. And so I really lucked out. I love my mentor, and it just required a lot of like digging and research to try to find someone. And you might not find someone who's like, the perfect fit, but then they become the perfect fit over time as you like build your relationship with each other. So yeah, fit is like the biggest the biggest thing in a mentor-mentee relationship.
I'll chime in as someone who really came out on the later side of things as a bisexual woman to myself while I was in grad school, actually. So let's say about, I don't know, who's counting? Only like five years ago or so. So I don't even like using the word late because I know that it's like different for everyone and the party was waiting. But I will say that I was always what we kind of like anecdotally like to say was like a very eager, involved ally. So I was a question that I was asking when I was looking at programs, and I was specifically drawn to programs in locations where it felt like it was a very like affirming and involved and like a city where there were a lot of opportunities for advocacy. And I do wish, of course, in retrospect, that I had thought a little bit more through. I mean, I didn't know what I didn't know, but I have run into some obstacles in terms of like moments where in mentorship or with research guidance, I didn't have those resources because I didn't like have that on my radar specifically in the like researcher supervision realm of things. But it was always something that was important to me lifestyle wise before I even knew why.
I can jump in here. I think school and location were two very important things for me. So I'm in the Boston area right now, and that was really important to me in terms of knowing that politically it was a much more safer environment in terms of LGBTQ rights. So I felt safer there, especially coming from New York City and Philadelphia for school and just where I'm from. And in terms of my program, I do have two mentors who I think really have combined both of my interests. So one of them is more focused on racial and ethnic minority mental health disparities, and the others focus more on LGBTQ hate crimes and microaggressions. So being able to bridge, both of their research and finding my own voice there has been incredible. And I'm really glad I was able to, be able to collaborate with both of them and find a very safe, supportive environment to grow there.
I was fairly broad when I applied to graduate school in terms of locations. When I was applying for my doctorate, I knew I was hoping to be in kind of trauma recovery broadly, and then I was looking for people who might help fit these other interests in, or could support these other interests. When I applied to graduate school, there was like maybe one or two people kind of in clinical or clinical community programs who were studying this intersection that I was interested in. But I was more looking for folks who could support or would be interested in broadening their research in some way, so that I could help bring something new to their lab. And I did a lot of learning while on these these interviews that we used to do, these like in-person interviews. And I had times where I learned things about potential faculty advisors, or something about the program that ultimately contributed to me withdrawing my application, which is a bummer. And it's hard to have to learn these things like in this context in particular. I had some mentors and I was really lucky that I was doing my post-bac research assistantship in an environment where I had advisors and mentors who I felt safe talking to about, my experiences as a queer person applying to graduate school, what I should be looking for, what kinds of questions I should be asking. And it was really helpful to have their perspectives and to say, you should really be challenging people about this thing, or how, what are the departmental policies that you might want to ask about, right? What should you be paying attention to, right? Just like, does the psychology building have like a non-gendered bathroom as an option? What does their student health insurance look like, right? Could you access the kinds of care you might want? It was a lot of legwork, but I ultimately think I landed in a department that allowed for some community and environment that was protective and affirming, which was so helpful because my advisor ultimately left the program. And then I was like, oh no, if I had come here just to be with her, and then she was the only allied person in the department, I might have been in a really different situation. So I think that there was times where it was definitely a balance, right? Like, how do you ask these questions without necessarily feeling as though you're putting yourself at risk to not ultimately get an offer? It was challenging, but I was going through people's CVs and making sure that, even if they weren't publishing in like LGBT sexual violence or PTSD recovery specifically, they were kind of demonstrating areas of diversity and growth in other parts of their vidas. Like, what committees were they sitting on? Were they co-authored on papers where they had some exposure to diversity broadly, right? Thinking through some of these other things that can signal, right? These signals that people can choose or not to choose, right? Where folks like putting their pronouns in their bios. What does it signal? Everybody you email in the department has their pronouns in your bio, but the faculty you're applying to doesn't, right? And then paying attention to those things.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue in, actually, Allison, to talking about kind of this next step. So I think there's a big piece of this in terms of what does it look like to apply to grad school, and then also what does it look like when you're in graduate school as well. So I'm wondering if some or all of you, who would be interested in speaking to this, would talk to what types of support are available in your program specifically for SGM interests or for those with SGM identities. So things like, what types of support would you want to look for, or would you want to have around when you are applying to grad school? And now that you're in grad school, what types of support are available to you, if any, in the department, as well as kind of externally, that you found to be especially helpful?
Okay, I'll go. So yeah, our program offers, some support for SGM students. It hasn't always been there, and it is, constantly evolving. They just came out with like this Betty Council, which is the Belonging, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee or Council that really, uh, overlooks the whole program, making sure that diversity considerations are in place throughout the curriculum, student involvement, and other areas of the program, which I really like. And that's new. That's not something that was in place when I was first there. There was a student organization that was, that was dedicated to, promoting a safe environment for sexual minority students. And the actual title, though, wasn't inclusive of transgender or gender diverse students. And so that's something that in my year, we actually worked together to change the name and make it more inclusive, to hopefully, increase recruitment of students who are more diverse in terms of gender. And so I'm really happy about that. And that's something that will continue on. And that's something to consider in programs. Like, sure, maybe it may not be completely inclusive, yet you as a student, and as long as you have, the support of your supervisors or mentors or other students or other, faculty in the program, like these are things that you can make happen in your program too. However, it's also not your responsibility to make the change or anything. And so it would kind of just be easier to be in a program that already supports you, especially because it is such a stressful time of your life. And so, to already be supported, having all those supports in place would just be one less thing to stress about in the program. But yeah, ultimately at the end of the day, we do have some level of power to make change happen as students within our programs.
Yeah, I'll echo Benji on that, I think it was in my second year that those of us who are on the diversity and inclusion action team at American University finally made it happen that we were able to get gender inclusive restrooms in the psychology building where we run participants and see patients in the clinic. And actually many reasons why that was important, but we finally made that happen. And I will say that overall, these things that everyone has touched on already are really important things to ask when you're looking for graduate programs. And then once you get there, because you may not have it in you, the bandwidth to do that sort of potentially emotional labor, not to mention the time and effort that goes into it to help make those things happen. And at the same time, you may have to balance that with other things, right? Like if the programs that have all those things set out for you, that have a match of a research mentor for you, are in areas where the stipend doesn't cover your cost of living and you have to look elsewhere, obviously there are other factors. And we want to be mindful of the fact that not everyone can just pick this, and not that you're picking anyway, right? You have to see where you get offers, but you may have to look at programs in areas where it's easier cost of living, and therefore maybe it's not as inclusive in that spot. But I agree that it's something to consider, not just at the university, not just in the city, but in the department. I will say that American University at the undergraduate level, the college does I think a fantastic job with having affirming spaces and events and opportunities for LGBTQ+ folks and students, whereas the various different graduate departments, even psychology, are maybe a little bit behind on that and have a lot of room to grow. And I think that a lot of the heavy lifting has been the students in the program during my time there for making progress.
Anything else others would add, or external resources that you found to be helpful?
I got involved in a community organization, LGBT community organization, after maybe a year and a half of the pandemic, and sitting alone in my department being I'm having these sad gay feelings and I just would like to be with community again. And I'm so grateful that I've been able to coordinate, to volunteer with this community organization. I run a support group for LGBT teens, and it's made a lot of my time here feel so meaningful and so fun. And I've met queer adults in the area. I think so many of us relocate in a big way for graduate school. I'm from the East Coast, and I moved to the corn country. I'm out in the cornfields now. So it was a big transition for me, and I felt a little bit like a alien visiting from another like planet coming into the corn country, and being able to meet queer adults and hang out with queer folks who are not necessarily connected to the university was just like such a wonderful experience for me. Getting in contact and in touch with other grad students was also really helpful, and then learning more about like the community I was actually living in, that I was paying my taxes in, and being able to see what was going on outside of this ivory bubble was like so valuable for me, and I was so grateful for it. So would for sure recommend, if you have, particularly if you're moving somewhere. Illinois Champaign is like in the cornfields, but it is still in Illinois. But if you're moving into a new state or a new place, taking a step out of your university can often be the best way to feel more comfortable where you are, if you have the capacity to.
Also, on that note, quick plug for ABCT's SGM SIG, Sexual and Minority Special Interest Group. That is one of the first places I went when I was going through my my days of bi-panic identity crisis / joy, and felt tons and tons of community and mentorship, and just, yeah, great opportunities for connection there as well.
For those who aren't as familiar with SIGs, would one of you mind just briefly describing why that's a valuable experience? Because I think you're right, and it's certainly something that I did not know about before I started grad school, and I think it would have been a helpful resource for me. Not to put anyone on the spot.
I need to jump in and, also echo Alex with the ABCT SGM SIG, and there's tons of other SIGs out there, like the ONR SIG, the Oppression and Resilience SIG, SIG specific to people's identities as well. As one of the student reps for the ABCT SGM SIG, there's tons of opportunities for mentorship. As Alex mentioned, there's just a really supportive, affirming community that has a really powerful voice in ABCT in terms of advocating for change and leveraging support where it is to advance marginalized communities in the SIG. So it's always a home for folks who are undergrads or just graduated in graduate school, or even in higher levels in their career. There's tons of ways to get involved and to support one another.
Great, thank you, Kevin. The next question is related a little bit more specifically to your relationship with your advisor. So what has been your experience navigating your relationship with your advisor, as well as your supervisors and mentors throughout graduate school? And how have you been able to do that, considering both your identity and your interests?
I think for me, what was most helpful was just keeping like a really open mind, being open to learning, open to new perspectives, and to, just try to put your best foot forward. Obviously, as a PhD student, it's a little different for me compared to a student who's more focused on clinical work. In my program, it's really clinically focused, and so that doesn't really give me a lot of extra time or support to work on my research. And so for me, that was entirely like self-motivated with my mentor, and there was no major pressure from my mentor to like focus on research as much, because it's a very clinically focused program and I don't have to. But it was obviously very encouraged by her, and she is the only social psychologist within our program. Everyone else is a clinical psychologist, and so naturally she is much more inclined to research. And luckily I am also very interested in research, so that was just like a beautiful fit there. But yeah, it was definitely a learning curve. I didn't have all that much research experience going into the program. And so there was a lot of new things I had to learn. And so being like patient, with yourself, and being open to feedback, and just the whole learning experience is really important, especially for fostering a positive relationship with your mentor, with anyone really. Just coming in with the mentality of like, okay, I recognize I don't know much and I need to learn. And my mentor wants to have a very positive, like mutually beneficial, supportive relationship with me. And just, always reminding yourself of that as you're going forward. Your mentor wouldn't have chosen you as a mentee if she didn't believe in you, if she didn't feel like she would have this like long lasting, or they wouldn't have this long lasting relationship with you, like even outside of the or beyond the program. So even after you stop becoming a student, you graduate, you're a whole doctor, and this sort of type of bond is expected to continue after that. And so keeping that in mind, like, okay, it might be stressful and it might be really difficult at this point in time, but it's worth it. And that you can get through it, and you will like grow, and it'll become like easier over time as you like gain new skills. But yeah, the transition can be really difficult. And so just keeping that in mind going in is my biggest advice.
I'll touch on something that happened with a clinical supervisor when I was in a practicum, and I was at that point in my graduate training only out to like a few people, probably like total. And however, I had gone through one of these like webinar, or maybe it was in person, I don't know, trainings around how when you work with individuals with SGM identities, it can be really powerful in therapy to bring in your own identity and share that, and then kind of share strategically from there as appropriate. And I really felt that in this particular client I was working with, it was clinically indicated, and I felt safe. However, I remembered that we record the sessions and I would have to talk about it in supervision. I was not out to my supervisor. So I agonized over that for a hot minute, and then decided I'm just going to tell my supervisor. But it felt scary at first, right? Even this is somebody who's evaluating me, and how will they react? And pardon if you can hear sirens. I am in downtown Chicago. Not sure if you can hear them on your end. But it turns out that, it was awkward. It was fine. But, this person, it's almost like, I don't know, I don't want to project what they were experiencing, but it felt like they maybe like didn't know what to do and what to say, and they like came out to me as straight, and like it was it was an interesting experience. Anyway, I did feel relief, at least, that like I knew that I could kind of proceed with therapy with this client, and it ended up really going in a beautiful direction in therapy. So it was like maybe a uncomfy experience for a little bit, but ultimately, and it was something I hadn't really thought about, like how that might impact the work that we're doing as trainees. And then a little tidbit on the research note is just to say that I'm in a lab that really doesn't do anything with any kind of like marginalized identities specifically. And so I did have to kind of like seek out external mentorship in the research realm when I wanted to integrate that into my work. And I promise they're not paying me for this, but the SGM SIG was exactly where I went for that. And I contacted a few folks, and I networked with a few folks, and was able to get connected with some really wonderful people who could kind of like mentor me both informally and formally in the research realm.
Also just want to echo Alex, not in terms of the SGM SIG, but it's wonderful. But my program is also clinically focused, and some of my richest relationships in grad school have been with clinical supervisors. And I think supervisors can really make a big difference in our clinical training or even in our personal development. So one of my supervisors has been incredible in really challenging me to be more of myself in the clinical sessions. And that was something I wasn't really used to in my previous training, is really leaning into my own identities and feeling empowerment through that and bringing that into those sessions with clients. So supervision really became something more empowering for me. And I think I needed that in my training journey to really find a joy that's within myself and let that shine in clinical training. So my supervisors, obviously, we talked about really serious things like self-disclosures and sessions, and then also being able to just talk about like RuPaul Drag Race and being able to really just like embody my queer identity in supervision and forming a trusting, safe relationship where I can bring up concerns around even my own safety in sessions with folks who do share anti-LGBTQ rhetoric or political beliefs. Being able to share that discomfort and process it with a supervisor and use those experiences to grow has been incredible. So I think clinical supervisors can be extremely enriching for our journeys.
Yeah, I myself am in a more research-oriented program, and we're in a program that's not necessarily a typical apprenticeship model. We're in a program model, so it's been I think a little bit at times scary to be like, oh no, I applied here to work with this one person. What do you mean I have to like find new mentors? But it's also been awesome. It's been an awesome experience to get to know folks, in other departments who are kind of thinking about social problems from a different lens, like folks in social work or counseling or human and family development, and also folks at other universities, and in the areas in which I have interests that kind of go outside of the scope of what my advisor really has expertise in. She's been really supportive in having her students pursue that. And I've been really fortunate, I think, to have other faculty who are in our department and on our campus who are excited and interested in working with students who share their research interests. In terms of like clinical work, I think this is something that I wish both that students receive more training in and that faculty supervisors and clinical supervisors receive more training in. How do you respond when a patient is perpetrating microaggressions or is engaging in ways with you that are really about the identities in which you hold? And I think that this is something that we don't necessarily have a good script for, right? Like, how do you respond when somebody says something homophobic or transphobic to you, and then you're like sitting there in session, you're like, wow, I was not planning on coming out to my client, or this is just something that I now have to sit with. Like, how comfortable do I feel engaging in this behavior? And then having a supervisor you may or may not feel comfortable discussing this with for a lot of reasons, right? So I think this is something that I certainly hope there's a future webinar on that's like geared towards clinical supervisors. I think that would be really, really cool.
Yeah, don't mind me just taking notes about that. Yeah, I mean, I think you all are touching on a really good point, which is one of the biggest stressors of this program is that and these programs generally is that they're so multifaceted, and that can also, it can be a stressor and it can be a benefit. And that if you don't find, it sounds like that mentorship that you're looking for in one space, that being able to kind of actively seek that out, to your point, Alex, and find it in other spaces can be really valuable. Or if you have it in a research capacity, feeling like you can also find it elsewhere in a clinical capacity as well. So in thinking a little bit more about research, how has it been navigating and conducting research when you might be the first one studying your topic of interest, especially if there's limited support in that area research-wise?
I think it's been really, really, truly just so helpful to be open to reaching out to new advisors or folks who you really admire their work and saying, I have this project, here's what I'm thinking, you know, I'm interested in this other thing that you do, how would you integrate this? So the number of cold emails I sent to folks from other universities or postdocs, and I was like, hey, so I read your master's thesis and you did this thing, and they're like, whoa. It's I think something that has challenged me to, I think, be a friendlier and more open scholar, thinking about you know, reaching out to people over email can feel so awkward, but being like, hey, I met you at ABCT 4 years ago. I hope you don't remember me. I was so sweaty at the time. But I would really love your perspective on this project that I'm working on, and being open to that perspective, and both kind of owning the expertise that you have. You know, maybe you are one of the 6 people in the country right now who wants to research this thing, owning that expertise while also being really open to other perspectives. I think it's been a fun journey learning how to be like confidently curious and engaging with folks. Yeah.
I love your use of the phrase confidently curious. And I think, you know, even in my area, being able to show curiosity by reaching out to folks outside of my program has been some of the most meaningful experiences for me. So even being able to do research at practicum sites where there's a lot of treatment work already happening there, and being able to have access to SGM populations with OCD or other anxiety related conditions, and finding mentors there, bringing your interests in SGM work to mentors who don't really have an interest or expertise in, but being able to bridge both of your interests has been really rewarding for me. It can be challenging to explain certain types of concepts and topics, but at the end of the day, it was incredibly rewarding for me to explore different types of research there and publish on some of the work.
Yes, I want to echo what Allison and Kevin are saying about just like reaching out. Like that's probably one of the most important skills that any, you know, doctoral student could have. Just being able to reach out not only to students, but also like mentors or potential colleagues that you meet at conferences. You know, it takes some courage to be able to do that, and you know, some navigation, and you're not always sure what you're getting into, but just being like confidently curious. I really like that term. That's a good one. Really will go far. If you feel like you're not getting enough research support, if you're not like doing like as much as you'd like to within your own program and the constraints of your own program, then you can look elsewhere. Like you're not limited to one program in order to do your work, like research wise. Clinically probably, but research wise, you're a little less inhibited. You can, you know, collaborate with this university or with this student, and yeah, and being from like a clinically focused program, like that's exactly what I had to do. I'm very interested in research. I want to do research probably for the rest of my life. And so not being able to do as much research early on, because, you know, limited funding, you know, limited support, just not as much research expectations within my program. You just meet people who you need to meet through like conferences. And so going to places like ABCT was like life-changing for me. You meet people who have similar interests as you that many of your cohort do not have. I'm like the only person in my cohort who is interested in LGBTQ health, and other students who may be interested in LGBTQ health aren't like research focused. And so that was a struggle for me, just having to find people to like feel like, you know, connected to and be able to feel like I'm doing what I want to be doing within my program. And that really enhances the quality of your experience in your program to be able to do what you want to do. But that takes some, you know, legwork on your end to be able to find those experiences and like sometimes like create those experiences for yourself.
Absolutely. I just want to echo what everyone said and share the kind of funny story that I was, I don't know if anyone else has the experience, but sometimes when someone's like, what's your dissertation about? I kind of want to just be like, I don't want to talk, don't ask me. I don't want to talk about it right now. But I was catching up with a friend who was in my lab, like she graduated several years ahead of me, but we became friends in the small overlap that we had. And she's like a full doctor, as Benji said earlier. And I told her kind of like the elevator pitch, and she's like, oh, like one of my like interns who was here, who I was supervising at my site, did something really similar for her dis. I'm going to connect you with her. And she connected me with the person who I had met like very briefly at like a couples sig cocktail hour at ABCT like years prior. So then I was like, whoa. So I reached out to her, and turns out her dis was like so different enough, but like similar. And we were able to connect about that. And it just made me realize it's a very small world. And sometimes it's really worth like talking about it, because you just don't know like where that could lead, and being curious and open and willing to talk about it and pursue ideas that maybe weren't what you initially set out to do. I'm currently in the stage of having to like practice a lot of acceptance around it just being a dis, and it is what it is right now. So that's where my head's at with that.
That makes a lot of sense. So the next question, and there's just a couple left. So for those of you for whom this applies, there can be a lot of stress that comes with an SGM identity and or doing research within the community that you're a part of. So can you speak to your experiences and what you've found to be especially helpful in this space?
I can jump in and speak to something that's been helpful. I think, yeah, there's definitely a lot of stressors, but with my dis, it's mostly online, but there is also a phone call interview portion. And then at the end of the online questionnaire battery, there's also like an open-ended question. And I like, my heart has been so touched by like some of the feedback I've gotten from participants, just saying like, wow, didn't know anybody was researching this topic, or nobody ever asks me about these questions and I feel really seen, or wow, I feel so validated that someone's doing this work. And it helps remind me like, okay, this is hard. A lot of this feels like more challenging than I ever anticipated, but it's those moments that give me that like burst of energy and motivation to keep going and say like, yeah, it's just a dis, but like, we're doing something cool here, and it could lead to something else, and it could help inform so-and-so or whoever else who's also doing this work, and connect me back into that original like inspiration and motivation, and some of those factors of my own identity and the community that make it all important in the first place.
I agree. I feel like keeping that in mind as you progress throughout the program, and even as you choose programs, like want to figure out if this is the career path you want to go in, is to just have that in mind, like what impact are you making, or what impact do you want to make, what are you doing in terms of how aligned those actions are in terms of with your own values. And that's really motivating in itself, just to get that spark going. Because, being in this program or any doctoral program is really difficult, and it could test like your patience, your energy levels, and it could make you lose sight of like the bigger picture of why you got into this in the first place, what you hope to do with any project that you're working on. And it could, like really help motivate you throughout, and just make your experience better, because you feel like you're really doing something that matters not only to you, but also to society, and the clinical world. Whatever your research goals are, just reminding yourself of what those are is really helpful. I agree.
I think I love these points, and I think that in psychology there can still be a lot of stigma surrounding like engaging in research or engaging in research by an issue that you're personally impacted by, and it's something that's it either gets communicated, it can get communicated explicitly or implicitly in some ways. But when I just, take a step back and reflect on like the experiences of like my LGBT loved ones, I think they would all feel really grateful that like a queer scholar was engaging in queer research, and feeling like it ultimately that feels very worth it to be a part of and to have and to be like out while doing this research too. It feels worth any potential consequences, but it is something for sure that I think like as the field should be continuing to push forward and to think more critically about who gets to be a quote unquote like impartial researcher in an area, or how might we need to start thinking more critically about the ways we know, and how it is that impacts the ways we understand research, and who we're really doing that research for, if not for the folks that are impacted by it. So something I think a lot about, something I've grapple with for sure as I think about like myself as a person, how out do I want to be, and then also what does it mean when like somebody is reading my research profile, whether it be like an undergrad who's looking for mentorship, or like a future client, or I don't know, well, maybe one day, fingers crossed, a future graduate student, if I make it out of my doctoral program, I will, right? But like, what will it mean when somebody reads my pronouns and goes, okay, right? Like that will hopefully help this feel like worth the maybe the quote unquote risks that I'm taking now.
Yeah, I love the term research. I didn't know about that I was about to say growing up. I'm kind of like growing up again in this program, I guess. But in the beginning, like I knew I was interested in this, but I never heard the term research. And the first time I heard that term, it was very like validating. I was like, yeah, like these identities are really important to me, and I feel connected to them and to the communities that those identities belong to. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like that's okay that you are doing research not only for others, but also like for yourself and for the affirmation of your own identities too. And that yeah, I before that I thought I heard that narrative of us not being like impartial, or but in fact it could be like the biggest strength to have someone that's so invested in the research and looking at it from a lens of the population that you're studying, while keeping in mind that there could be varied experiences within that population, but just embracing that. Yeah, I love that.
You can stay confidently curious with the populations we're studying too.
Beautiful, tying it all back in. How does your SGM identity intersect with other identities such as race, religion, immigration status? And to the extent to which you're willing, can you share your experiences in graduate school based on this intersection of identities and related social, political factors? A loaded question, I know, but I think an important one.
I think tying back to what I was just talking about, I think about my status as a white person a lot, as part of why it feels very important to be out. I will be able to be out and comfortably out in more situations than more people. The types of barriers I might face are not the same as queer people of color, and how and they don't necessarily need to be the first person to put their pronouns in their bio to have these difficult conversations, right? How might putting myself out there for potentially a little bit of harm create an opportunity for other folks to have that space open as well? I think about that a lot as a white queer person here in my program.
as a queer person of color and an immigrant, my identities is something that I'm always thinking about and hyper aware of in so many different settings, from a classroom, a research lab, to the clinical setting. And I think about how some of them intersect at marginalization and at times privilege as a cis male. And when I can use my voice to amplify communities around me that are marginalized or experience more isms. So I think about, even in our election or political elections, or even in a pandemic where xenophobia, racism became more salient. It was always there, but became more salient for a lot of communities experiencing the brunt of it. And I think, being in a clinical psychology program, and I think this is a point Allison made earlier, is looking for signals of safety, looking for signals of where I can bring some of my discomfort and experiences to supervisors or mentors or instructors to talk about the ways that my experiences intersect with the materials, or to find, safe, affirming individuals that I can ask for support from. So I think, being able to be willing to seek support as well as having support available is critical in these programs. And I think signals are one way that individuals in power, supervisors, advisors, so on, do have to step into those shoes of showing that they are available and that they care about these issues, and that they're actively bringing it up in settings that I'm a part of in a genuine, authentic way, and they're showing that they're willing to learn and support me in the ways that I'm looking for.
Yes, I think that is so important for people with multiply marginalized identities. It's not just one identity they're thinking about, it's multiple, and also getting that acknowledgement of how they're intersecting and how that is a big, there's a big gap in our standard traditional curriculums about how these identities intersect. And so finding programs that validate and affirm those intersections and acknowledge them is so important for students looking for programs. And another thing for students who are bilingual, trilingual, quadruple lingual, that's another thing to keep in mind, especially in clinical psychology programs, because you will have that opportunity to work with clients from various populations. And so and that might improve your experience if you're able to work with populations who either share similar identities or that have an identity that you can relate to in terms of language. So you're filling that gap, and that's creating meaning and allowing you to create a better experience for yourself. So myself, I'm half Puerto Rican. No one knows, no one ever recognizes it based on my very white appearance. And I do speak Spanish and everything. And so that was something I was keeping in mind when I was looking for programs like South Florida, lots of Spanish speakers, close to Miami and everything. And luckily that's an experience I'm able to have in this program. I'm able to work with Spanish speaking populations, and that's made a big difference for me because I feel like I am sort of filling a gap and filling a need. And that's something that people who speak more than one language can keep in mind when they're picking programs, just so they're not too burnt out, because they are energized by these experiences throughout their time in the program.
Yeah, I love hearing from all of you on this. And I also remain very always kind of aware of my white identity, and also as a cis woman, these identities definitely intersect with being a queer woman as well, on top of added privilege with an asterisk around being married to a cis man. It is definitely a privilege, and it is also a way that, I may not feel as affirmed, especially when I do come out to someone and I get a lot of interesting eyebrow reactions and slightly potentially microaggressive questions or comments about that. But I definitely, in terms of maintaining this balanced awareness of, or balancing awareness of tokenization in our workplaces and in our spaces of folks who have more marginalized identities that I have, while also making sure to be kind of finding ways to give up my power or my voice so that it in turn elevates the voices of those who historically haven't had as much power or voice in that space. And this like kind of thing happened like literally the other day, where like my co-residents and I are pitching some new content for a treatment program, and to collectively, actually I made the Google Doc, but we're pitching content around like systemic barriers and intersectional identities, and the powers that be kind of turned right to my co-resident who also is queer but is a queer person of color, and we're like, oh, are you developing the material for that talk, right? And it's not that they're not, we all are, but then that person was put in a position to say, oh, well, actually, like, you know, Alex is developing it too, right? And I just, it strikes me that even in the most seemingly progressive of spaces, like these kinds of things come up all the time. And I think maintaining that awareness, the curiosity and the willingness to sit with discomfort and question it and talk about it and bring it to the light so that we can all kind of like keep growing and having each other's backs, especially those of us within sexual and gender minority kind of communities, is really important. But then I'll also add that I have this other identity that is that I am a mom. And so like, that's also been like an interesting additional identity that I'm carrying with me. And I think I knew to some level going into graduate school that my partner and I would likely try to have a child. And so it was actually important in that regard to look at states where there are progressive laws around things like abortion, right? Because I think that is something that affects all kinds of communities. It affects everybody, and it's a right. But on that note, it could be the same for folks who have like trans and non-binary and gender diverse identities, looking out for graduate schools that are in states where your insurance will cover gender affirming care, because there are a lot of states that are going in and kind of like blocking that with insurance companies. And so thinking about the different identities that you hold, I think it is a factor when looking into graduate school. Even if I wish it weren't that way, but also now thinking about the future, now I'm thinking about, you know, in my internship here in terms of careers, like I'm so curious, this will be a later conversation, but constantly debating this idea of like, go and be like this trailblazer in a state that like needs more, you know, passionate care, versus going to a state where my like ethics and morals would be on the line of like potentially losing my license because I'm going against a state law by disclosing that someone has a trans child, or what, I don't know, whatever. There's a lot going on right now that I think brings up really important questions for us in our line of work, that in addition to our own identities, but also to the work that we're doing and the populations we want to work with and we want to serve, it's all related. And I think that it can be great to want to be that, you know, pioneer going into the spaces where the folks need that lifeline. And at the same time, it's important to be checking in with yourself and putting on your own oxygen mask and making sure that you're practicing self-care and not burning out, because then you can't care for anybody. So that's my spiel.
And I think you bring up such a good point, Alex, which is that graduate school, you're in it for the long haul. And so these types of questions that you're and considerations that you're bringing up on the front end, I think are so important. And that a lot of people say going into graduate school, like, you can't afford to be picky. And while in some ways that's certainly true, I think in other ways you all are really speaking to this idea that like, you have to be picky in a lot of situations, because that's not only protecting you and your values, but also your mental health in this grueling and exciting, but grueling program. So I really appreciate all of your comments and really speaking to that, because I think it's an important one and maybe not something that we talk about enough. I have one more question for you, and just thinking about and hopefully sharing some of your words of wisdom and broadening the scope a little bit. I think we've covered a lot in terms of applying to grad school and navigating grad school, both in a research space and a clinical space. But if we had to zoom out a little bit, what words of wisdom would you recommend to your past selves or to individuals who may be watching this webisode today? So maybe things that you wish you had known, or that you've learned along the way that you found to be especially valuable.
Going back to your point, Sarah, I wish I had been pickier. I got advice that, like, when I was applying to graduate schools, that I had to be prepared to go to any program that I applied to. So I should apply to any program. And I heard that and I said, oh my gosh, it's so competitive. I might only get one offer. And I have to be prepared to move anywhere in the United States, or else there's no way I'm going to get in anywhere. I think that the graduate school application process is no joke, and I don't want to dismiss that. And I'm grateful for where I ended up. And I think, like, looking back at my application process, I was more competitive than I was giving myself credit for. And I probably had more choices than I allowed myself to. And I wish I had considered more seriously considered, right, if it would have made sense for me to think critically, like, should I be applying this year if, like, this proportion of people I would want to work with are not taking students, or if it is the case that the interviews that I'm getting are all in this part of the country that I'm not sure I'm actually that comfortable living in. I think that I would have told myself to, really truly believe in myself. I was really lucky, and I'm grateful for where I ended up, of course. And I think this choice should have been more difficult for me to pick Illinois when I was picking graduate schools. I probably could have given myself a better shot and really believed in myself a little bit more, instead of just saying, oh, I know I've heard that this person is kind of tough, but it would be so great to be able to, right? Or maybe, like, I could make myself feel happy living for 6 years in, like, X location. No, it's all of my 20s. It's all of most people's 20s. People go to graduate school at different times, obviously, but it's your 20s, right? So I'm having a great period of my life. Like, I'm grateful that I live in Champaign. It was an awesome place to be getting my training. My research training is really, truly, I'm so grateful for it. And I think that, there were just some programs that I applied to that I didn't need to. And there were some programs that I didn't apply to because I assumed I wouldn't be able to get in. But I'm like, why did you give up on yourself? So don't forget that, like, this program, wherever you're applying, as much as you might want to go there, they are trying to recruit excellent students, right? They are trying to recruit you as much as you are trying to be recruited. And it's okay to have standards. It is your 20s. It's an important part of your life. All parts of your life are important, but it's an important part of your life. And it's okay to have expectations for what that part of your life is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that I would say that this is, like, similar to what Allison was saying, I think, but it is really important to consider the location and the context of the program. Now, that said, I also want to add this big major caveat, which is that, like, applying to graduate school, you're going to get so much advice from so many people, and a lot of it is contradictory. And somebody's going to say, no, that one's like this super high ranking program, or, oh, that one's an R1 and that one's, like, not so big, or, like, oh, this person is, like, really well known and can whatever. You're going to hear all these things and it might feel confusing. But I think it's, like, what it comes down to is, like, what are your values? Like, what is most important to you? Because it is a massive time commitment. It's a huge chunk of your life, the better part of a decade. It goes by faster than you think, but it's also, like, it's a real chapter of your life, right? And none of us predicted that there would be, like, this random, like, pandemic that just, like, happened. Well, and I definitely didn't predict that I'd be like, a pregnant grad student in a pandemic, like, and, you know, I ended up having complications and being on bed rest, but it doesn't matter. The point is that if I hadn't been, I was deciding between American University and a different school that was in a much more rural setting, in which case, you know, my partner and I would have had to have like been long distance for a certain period of time. And had there been all of the things that happened with the pandemic and everything, I think I would have felt so siloed and isolated. Whereas being in a community where I was walking distance from various friends in my program, and there was like a tight-knit community of even just like the random neighbors in my building complex. And it's not something I thought about really thoroughly before, right? But now in retrospect, I can say that whether it has to do with your queer identities or not, thinking about that context and that community, if that's a value to you, it's no small part of your whole experience.
Wow, these wisdoms are really hard to follow. I'll keep mine short. I think mine is really embrace yourself, right? And your values, who you are as a person, especially if you're an SGM identifying person. It is a really hard career, and you are the gift in the research you do, the clinical work that you do. And I think that's incredibly important, is to remind yourself of who you are and why you're here. And finding mentors who allow you to shine and bring out that piece of yourself that might get lost in, you know, all that you do. So really embracing yourself.
Yeah, what everyone else said. And I guess I'll end by saying, be confidently curious. Don't get too, what's the term? Like, don't get too much in your head about, oh, what if this happens? Or what if this happens? Like, if there's something that you feel pulled to, go for it and see what happens. And whether it blows up in your face or it doesn't, it's a learning experience. And you can always find like something beautiful out of this, wherever you will be in, especially in terms of doctoral programs. There's always something good about it. And also just finding your own sort of community and support within that area that might be more difficult in some settings than others. But that also is determined by your level of reaching out to. And so yeah, there's a lot of power you have that you may not realize, and you can make your experience what you can make it with the tools you have at the time, with your with the resources you have at the time, and yeah, just being flexible. And best of luck with everyone applying, because it is tough. And I hadn't thought about that when I was applying. I did not think, oh, I'm going to be spending all of my 20s here, because I'm 30 now and I'm still haven't graduated, and that's, you know, something I didn't consider. But luckily I found a program that I felt like I could enjoy and get what I needed out of it, and so I don't regret it at all. But that's definitely something I didn't keep in mind applying to programs. I just wanted to get into a program, that's it. And so that reminds me of what Allison said about like giving yourself credit, and just like, and what Kevin says about embracing yourself, and what Alex says about, you know, really picking like an environment that's going to be like safe and supportive, and keeping your relationships in mind, which is so important when it comes to like getting through a PhD or PsyD or whatever doctoral program. Like, so important, relationships.
Benji, I feel like I couldn't have summed it up better. So thank you for doing my job for me.
Great.
I'm so grateful. And I feel like this is the perfect note to end on. So we will end it here. Thank you again to this amazing group of panelists for being here and taking the time to share your perspective. It's really invaluable to hear from you and your experiences and your values and how you've navigated graduate school. As a reminder, there are many resources available both through ABCT and the SGM SIG websites. If you're interested in getting involved, I'm more than happy to pass those along. Feel free to reach out should you need them. And thank you again to all of you. This has been incredible.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.